Hi, Winnie.
Hi, good morning, Prudence. How
Good
are you?
morning. So, welcome to the ADHR podcast. On this episode, we are in conversation with Winnie Mageto, who is an economist and a public finance management practitioner. She's also working on her PhD in economics at the University of Nairobi. And Winnie is passionate about public debt and fiscal decentralization. So, one fun fact about Winnie is that she likes to make new friends, and hope that happens in the course of recording and pick a few friends amongst our listeners. Okay, so welcome, Winnie.
Thank you.
Would like to start us off, would like for you to speak about your work.
Okay, so the paper I was working on was titled it was Debt Sustainability, Reviewing Debt Sustainability in East Africa Community from a legal and institutional perspective. So what I did was I assessed debt using secondary sources of information from the Ministry of Finances of these countries. Also, I used IMF documentation like the Article 4 of the IMF, the Joint Debt Sustainability Analysis from World Bank and IMF, and also the country-specific debt reports. So this paper was a desktop analysis. We didn't use primary data. So what we were doing, we were reviewing public debt in EAC. So I focused on 4 countries. I focused on Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda. And this is because of the availability of their information. The information was available. And the other countries like Burundi, South Sudan, and Republic of Congo, the information was scanty. So that's why I focused on the 4 countries, which had adequate information for analysis.
Oh, thank you very much. So, based off on the research in these 4 countries, what would you say is the debt situation in these 4 countries?
So when I assessed the data of these 4 countries, I analyzed and found that debt is sustainable in these countries. However, there are risks that are associated with this public debt. And these risks are majorly exchange rate risks. And these risks occur because of high commercial external debt, which come with a lot of exchange rate risks because these debt are supposed to be repaid in foreign denominated currencies. So we are talking about repaying the debt in terms of dollars, in terms of euros, in terms of Japanese yen, and all those kinds of foreign currency. So in case of a shock, we talk about these countries paying a lot of money in terms of, it's like, for instance, in Kenya, we are going to pay a lot of shillings when the exchange rate is higher. So as much as the debt is sustainable, there is an issue of risks associated with this debt. And again, domestically, these countries are borrowing a lot of debt domestically. But again, there's a lot of refinancing risks. Refinancing risks meaning that this debt become due and we do not have that money to repay this debt. So we tend to borrow to pay.
To pay, yes.
Yeah. So that's the situation. The debt is sustainable, but there's a lot of the risks associated with the debt are also high.
So what you're saying is that the debt is sustainable, but then it becomes an endless loop of borrowing to repay this debt.
Yes.
Okay, interesting. So what would you say then are the actors based off on the institutions that you accessed? Would you pinpoint to particular institutions who should be held responsible? I'm pretty sure that's a question that you looked into, even from a personal perspective. Would like to know the back end of that. Who would you say is responsible for making the decisions on debt? On whose back should we be watching?
Okay, in terms of contracting debt in the EAC, different countries, actually the laws that support the contraction of debt are in the constitutions of these countries. So like in Kenya, we have laws that talk about, or they ensure that debt is contracted and managed prudently. So we are talking about the Public Finance Management Act. We are talking about, for instance, in Uganda, we are talking about Bank of Uganda Act. We are talking about there's a charter called Charter of Fiscal Responsibility in Uganda. We are talking about the Public Finance Management Act of Uganda. So there are laws that are enshrined in the Constitution that ensure that debt is contracted within the legal framework. Okay, those are the laws that are guiding the borrowing of debt. So we have institutions, for instance, we have the Parliament, we have the Office of the Auditor General, we have the Senate, we have the banks, that is the central bank. So the central bank will advise on the interest rate. The Parliament will approve, but the Ministry of Finance has a very key role. In Kenya, we call it the National Treasury. In Tanzania, we call it the Ministry of Finance. In Uganda, we call it the Ministry of Planning and Economic Development. In Rwanda, we call it the Ministry of Finance. This institution is a key player in debt contraction because legally, in the Constitution, they are mandated. The person that, or the person that ensures that we contract debt in a country is called the Ministry of Finance for those other countries. And in Kenya, it is the Cabinet Secretary of the National Treasury. So this is the person that is mandated by the Constitution to contract debt on behalf of the government. But he doesn't do, or she doesn't contract debt independently. He is guided by the law. And he's guided by, and again, these loans go through an approval process. The Senate, the Parliament, they are key players. And we have the Office of the Auditor General that audits the public debt expenditure. Where did this money go and how was it utilized? So it is not a one-man show. It is a teamwork. So there are many players that come into debt contraction. And again, before debt is contracted, it has to be approved by Parliament. Yeah, so there are many players that ensure that debt is contracted and it's managed prudently. So like, for instance, in Kenya, we have the Public Debt Management Office. And this Public Debt Management Office works independently to ensure that the debt that is contracted is actually contracted within the legal framework.
Yeah. So interesting. So what you're saying is that the institutions, it's a whole process, right?
It's a whole process.
It's a whole process. So you could not particularly pinpoint to a particular person. But it wouldn't be so wrong to say that you can look at in Kenya, for instance, you could look at the Cabinet Secretary.
His duty is to ensure that loan that we want is contracted. You see, why do we borrow these loans again? Is to finance the fiscal deficit. If we have an X amount of fiscal deficit, we have to contract debt equivalent to that amount. So the National Treasury, or the Cabinet Secretary of the National Treasury or the Minister of Finance will go to the Parliament. This is a fiscal deficit. This is what I want for us, for the Parliament to approve. So the Parliament, the buck stops at the Parliament. They are the ones approving or not approving the debt. So he is just a representative. He doesn't have the final say. The final say is for the Parliament.
So even as what you're telling a lot of Kenyans and listeners is that even as we go into the election cycle, it's very important who they vote into Parliament because that's who plays a major role.
Yeah, that is true. But again, it is not just approving. Sometimes the legal framework is there. The institutions are there managing debt. But we're able to see that most of the time, we do not abide by the law.
So we have an implementation issue.
We have serious implementation issues. And that is not just in Kenya alone, even the other EAC countries. For instance, we have an EAC protocol. We have the EAC Convergence Protocol. So this protocol requires that by 2021, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan should be able to have at least acquired that the debt, the total debt there, the gross debt that they are contracting is 50% of GDP.
Yeah.
But as of 2021, it's only Tanzania that had borrowed within that threshold. All the other countries had borrowed high above the 50% threshold. So we are not even following the EAC, the protocol or the law that is governing the EAC. So, and see, that is what is happening even in the country-specific, the borrowing framework. They are borrowing beyond.
Okay, so tell us a bit more about the EAC Convergence Protocol and what it entails.
So the EAC Convergence Protocol requires that these the EAC countries should have a head inflation of 8%. The countries should have the gross domestic debt. Each country should have a gross domestic debt of 50% of GDP and an import cover of 4.5%. But our focus again here is on public debt. So when we're looking at the public debt, it's only Tanzania that, as of 2021, it's only Tanzania that had borrowed less than the 50%. All the others had borrowed high and above the 50% threshold that is required by the EAC. And again, within these countries, we have protocols that are guiding debt service and also the debt as a percentage of GDP. So looking at maybe Uganda, we see that in 2021-2022, there's a report that published that they were using their revenue of 97% to repay debt. Yet the law required the country to use only 35% of the revenue to repay debt. So what had remained out of revenue to repay, when they were using 97%, was only 3% to finance the budget. So we are going to borrow so much to finance the budget because we are using a lot of money to finance or to pay debt. Yes.
Interesting. So out of your going through your paper, one challenge that stood out was, amongst others, was access to information. And also, like you pointed out in the beginning of the conversation, that you were only able to assess 4 countries.
Yeah.
Could you talk a bit about that and the challenges you faced overall?
Okay, so the major challenge that came out of this analysis was access to information, or adequate. Actually, it's adequate information, because the information in some countries' website, for instance, we're talking about South Sudan, there is an information, but the information is not adequate to be able to carry out an analysis. So to expound on these countries, to be able to know the EAC, the 7 countries adequately, in future maybe we'll require a primary data assessment or a primary data study so that we can cover and we are able to fill the gaps that are existing, because I was only able to cover the 4 countries. So for the 3 countries remaining, maybe a primary data assessment would be useful for that. So again, there's something that came out very clearly on availability of information. If you go to Rwanda, it had all the information was there. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the Constitution of Rwanda, it has a section where they are publishing on the local language, which is Kinyarwanda. Then we have a section for Kiswahili, a section for English, and also a section for French. So it's really interesting. No, they didn't have a section for Kiswahili. It was English, Kinyarwanda, and French. So that is for Rwanda. So all the other countries, excluding the 4 that I assessed, did not have adequate information to be able to carry out an analysis.
Okay, that's very interesting. So what do you think could be the reason why is that? Do you think that Burundi, for instance, do not have laws?
The laws are
publishing of this information, or
I would say also there are challenges within a country. So for Burundi, I'd say it is because of there's a lot of war. There has been a lot of war in Burundi. And even the IMF articles, the Article 4 of the IMF was not published. It was published a long time ago. So we could be talking about country-specific challenges. So maybe war in Burundi. We could talk about other challenges. So for the Republic of or for South Sudan, they have information up to 20. The latest information I saw was for 2018 on public debt.
Right.
So there could be country-specific challenges. Yeah. But the laws are there because all these countries have constitutions, and the constitution has all the laws that are guiding the country. So I would not say it is a challenge of law. Could be the laws are there, but these countries may not be abiding by the law.
Okay, so listening to you, it seems as though we have an accountability issue.
A transparency and
transparency
accountability issue.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. So you have proposed some recommendations. I'd like for you to talk about that, and what does these recommendations aim to achieve in the long run?
Okay, I gave out, as much as these countries are having challenges in having their debt to be sustainable, there is they're doing something to ensure that their debt is sustainable. For instance, we are talking about Kenya having a DRM, that is the Domestic Resource Mobilization Strategy. We're also having a tax policy. This is to enhance revenue. Same as Uganda, they are doing the same. For Tanzania, what they are doing, they have introduced a bond, a 25-year bond, and this bond has been put in place to ensure that the debt period, the debt repayment period is longer. So they have put in place strategies to ensure that their debt is sustainable. So the major challenge that was there was actually an implementation challenge. So there are strategies that have been put in place. There are also measures. We talk about the fiscal consolidation measure in Uganda and Kenya, but this has been a moving target. The implementation has been the challenge. So I recommended the Office of the Auditor General. You see, the Office of the Auditor General, it audits the expenditure or the amounts of money that has been allocated or has been borrowed to the country. They should also audit the strategies in the medium-term debt management strategies. They should also track and see whether these strategies or these measures that were put in place have they been adhered to. So it is not just auditing the finance, but also audit the process.
I see.
Yeah, and I'm talking about the supreme audit institutions in all these EAC countries. Yeah, so they should ensure that there is adherence of both domestic laws and also the EAC laws governing debt. So another recommendation that I put forward was on the role of Parliament. The Parliament plays an oversight role in debt contraction and also in ensuring that or in approval of this debt. So the Parliament has a very key role. So they should also look at the return on investment.
Right.
Why are we borrowing? Is the project going to be implemented soon, or it's going to be implemented later? So we want the Parliament to have a to be very vigilant in the debt process, the whole debt process, not just approval and oversight, the whole debt contraction process. The Parliament should play a very key role. Yeah, they should be in all the stages of debt contraction.
Okay, so what you're saying is that Parliament should take up a bigger role.
Yes.
In terms of accountability.
Yes, in terms of accountability and also ensuring that this public debt information is published.
And is openly available.
And openly available so that the citizens can see where did our money go.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So maybe to just finally ask, as has been the case in many other countries, what happens is that, once research is done, information is available. But then in terms of readability of this information, would an ordinary citizen go and, say, access, a paper or work done, or it's been published on the government website, but then are they able to read and comprehend? Is that something that you examined, or is something that you came across?
I didn't examine that element, but the usability of the information is in Kenya. I noticed there is something called the citizen version of the budget.
Yes.
So the citizen version of the budget, it has figures and pictures, and you can be able to see what the pictures are saying. So all the other countries which do not have citizen versions of this information should be able to emulate from Kenya and publish a citizen version of maybe a budget document, a debt register. I know debt registers could be a bit tricky, but information that can be used. For instance, talk about in a pictorial presentation, talk about this is the amount of money that we collected, this is the amount of money that we are in deficit, and this is the amount of money that we spent. People are able to see that we are borrowing this, we are spending this, and this is our deficit, so we need to borrow.
Okay, interesting. So Kenya is definitely the country to emulate in terms of access to information. Is that what you're saying?
Not Kenya only. We also have all these 4 countries that I evaluated.
Yes.
They had adequate information, very adequate information. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Winnie, for making time.
Thank you too.
All right.
Okay.